January 31st, 1990. The line stretched for blocks through the freezing Moscow streets. Thousands of people, bundled in heavy coats and fur hats, waiting patiently in the bitter cold for a chance to eat at McDonald's. The first McDonald's in the Soviet Union had opened that morning in Pushkin Square, right in the heart of Moscow, and it had instantly become the most popular destination in the city. Inside the Kremlin, just a few kilometers away, the reaction was decidedly mixed. Mikhail Gorbachev sat in a meeting with his advisors, listening to reports about the McDonald's opening. The restaurant had served over 30,000 customers on its first day, a world record for McDonald's. The lines had started forming before dawn. Soviet citizens were waiting hours in sub-zero temperatures for hamburgers and French fries and Coca-Cola. Western journalists were covering it as a major news story, a symbol of the opening of the Soviet Union, of glasnost and perestroika in action. 30,000 people, Gorbachev said, shaking his head in a mixture of amusement and disbelief. 30,000 people waited in line to eat at an American fast food restaurant in Moscow, in the capital of the Soviet Union. Alexander Yakovlev, one of Gorbachev's closest advisors and a key architect of perestroika, smiled slightly. "It's quite a sight, Mikhail Sergeyevich. I drove past Pushkin Square this morning. The line wrapped around the block. People were excited, happy. Some were treating it like a special occasion. They had dressed up, brought their children, were taking photographs." "To eat hamburgers," Gorbachev said, still somewhat incredulous. "They dressed up and brought their children to eat hamburgers." "American hamburgers," Yegor Ligachev interjected sourly. Ligachev was one of the more conservative members of the Politburo, skeptical of Gorbachev's reforms, and particularly uncomfortable with the increasing Western influence in the Soviet Union. Capitalist fast food served by a capitalist corporation on Soviet soil. This is what perestroika has brought us. Gorbachev looked at him sharply. "What it has brought us, Yegor Kuzmich, is happy Soviet citizens. Did you see their faces? Did you see the excitement? When was the last time you saw Soviet citizens that enthusiastic about anything our government provided?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew the answer. Soviet citizens were rarely enthusiastic about government services. They waited in long lines for poor quality goods, dealt with surly service workers, accepted shortages and inefficiency as normal. The contrast with McDonald's, where the service was fast and friendly, where the food was consistent and plentiful, where the restaurant was clean and well organized, was stark and undeniable. "This is embarrassing," Ligachev said. "Soviet citizens lining up by the thousands to eat American food as if we cannot feed our own people, as if capitalist hamburgers are superior to Soviet cuisine. The Western media is portraying this as a triumph of capitalism over socialism, and frankly, they're not wrong. They're also not entirely right," Yakovlev countered. "McDonald's didn't just appear in Moscow by magic. It took 14 years of negotiations to make this happen. George Cohon, the Canadian McDonald's executive who made this possible, worked with Soviet authorities for over a decade. We had to approve this. We had to allow it. This is part of our strategy of opening up to the West, of allowing foreign investment, of modernizing our economy." "And look at the results," Yakovlev continued. "McDonald's built a food processing plant in Moscow Oblast to supply the restaurant with ingredients that meet their quality standards. They trained hundreds of Soviet workers in modern service techniques. They're paying higher wages than most Soviet employers. They're demonstrating what's possible when you combine Western efficiency with Soviet workers. They're demonstrating what's possible under capitalism," Ligachev said bitterly. "Efficient service, quality products, satisfied customers, everything that Soviet socialism has failed to provide." Gorbachev stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Moscow. From here, he couldn't see Pushkin Square, couldn't see the thousands of people waiting in line for McDonald's, but he could imagine it, could picture the scene that was being broadcast around the world. Soviet citizens, in the heart of Moscow, embracing American capitalism with an enthusiasm they had never shown for Soviet socialism. "Yegor is right about one thing," Gorbachev said quietly. "This is embarrassing. Not because McDonald's opened in Moscow. That's a positive development, a sign of our opening to the world, but because of what it reveals about our own failures." He turned to face his advisors. "Why are 30,000 people willing to wait in line for hours to eat at McDonald's? Because the food is good and consistent. Because the service is fast and friendly. Because the restaurant is clean and well organized. Because they know exactly what they're going to get, and they know it will meet their expectations. Now ask yourselves," Gorbachev continued, his voice taking on an edge, "how many Soviet restaurants can say the same? How many Soviet stores provide consistent quality, fast service, clean facilities? How many Soviet institutions give citizens what they expect and need?" No one answered. "This is what perestroika is about," Gorbachev said. "Not just opening up to the West, not just allowing foreign investment, but learning from what works, adopting better practices, modernizing our economy and our society. McDonald's is showing us what's possible. Now we need to apply those lessons to our own system." Nikolai Ryzhkov, the Prime Minister, spoke up. "Mikhail Sergeyevich, with respect, there's a difference between a single restaurant serving hamburgers and reforming the entire Soviet economy. McDonald's can succeed because it's a small operation with Western management and Western standards. But our economy involves millions of workers, thousands of factories and farms, decades of established practices. We can't just adopt Western methods and expect them to work." "Why not?" Gorbachev challenged. "Why can't we adopt methods that work? Why can't we provide the kind of service and quality that McDonald's provides? What is it about Soviet socialism that makes efficiency and quality impossible?" "It's not impossible," Ryzhkov said carefully, "but it requires fundamental changes. Changes in how we organize production, how we compensate workers, how we measure success. Changes that many people will resist, that will disrupt established systems, that will threaten entrenched interests." "In other words," Gorbachev said, "it requires exactly the kind of reforms that perestroika is supposed to implement. And McDonald's opening in Moscow shows us why those reforms are necessary. Because Soviet citizens clearly prefer what capitalism offers, at least in this case, to what socialism has been providing." He walked back to his desk and sat down. "Let me ask you all something. When you see those lines at McDonald's, when you see how excited people are, when you see them treating a visit to an American fast food restaurant as a special occasion, what does that tell you about the state of Soviet socialism?" Yakovlev answered carefully. "It tells me that we have failed to provide our citizens with basic consumer goods and services. It tells me that decades of prioritizing heavy industry and military production over consumer needs has left people desperate for quality products and good service. It tells me that perestroika and glasnost are necessary and overdue. It tells me that we're losing," Ligachev said bluntly. "The ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism. We're losing it. And McDonald's opening in Moscow is a symbol of that loss. The Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state, the nation that was supposed to demonstrate the superiority of socialism over capitalism, is now welcoming capitalist corporations with open arms because we can't provide what our own people need." Gorbachev looked at him steadily. "So what would you have us do, Yegor? Close McDonald's? Ban foreign investment? Go back to the old ways of doing things that have clearly failed? Is that your solution?" "I would have us remember what the Soviet Union stands for," Ligachev said. "Socialism, collective ownership, central planning. Not this embrace of capitalism that you're calling reform. The Soviet Union stands for serving its people," Gorbachev said firmly. "Or at least it should. And if we're not serving them, if they're so desperate for decent service and quality products that they'll wait hours in the cold for American hamburgers, then we need to change. That's what perestroika means. That's what glasnost reveals, the gap between our socialist rhetoric and the reality of Soviet life. He picked up a report from his desk. Do you know what this says? It says that the McDonald's in Moscow is using almost entirely Soviet-produced ingredients. Beef from Soviet farms, potatoes from Soviet fields, milk from Soviet dairy cows. The only thing American about this McDonald's is the name and the management system. So the problem isn't that Soviet resources are inferior, Gorbachev continued. The problem is how we organize and manage those resources. McDonald's can take Soviet beef and potatoes and turn them into food that people are excited to eat. Why can't our own restaurants do the same? Because McDonald's has different incentives, Ryzhkov said. They're motivated by profit, by customer satisfaction, by competition. Soviet restaurants are motivated by meeting production quotas, by following central plans, by avoiding criticism from supervisors. The systems are fundamentally different. Then maybe we need to change our system, Gorbachev said. Maybe we need to introduce some of those capitalist incentives, profit, customer satisfaction, competition. Maybe that's what perestroika should mean. Ligachev looked alarmed. Mikhail Sergeyevich, you're talking about abandoning socialism. You're talking about introducing capitalism into the Soviet economy. That's not reform. That's betrayal of everything the Soviet Union stands for. What I'm talking about, Gorbachev said, his voice rising slightly, is making the Soviet Union work for its citizens instead of asking citizens to sacrifice for the Soviet Union. I'm talking about providing people with decent food, decent service, decent quality of life. If that requires learning from capitalism, if that requires adopting some market mechanisms, then so be it. He stood up again, too agitated to sit still. Do you know what the worst part of today is? It's not that McDonald's opened in Moscow. It's not that thousands of people lined up to eat there. It's that this is being portrayed, correctly, as a major event, as a symbol of change in the Soviet Union. Because it is a symbol. It's a symbol of how desperate our people are for something better than what Soviet socialism has been providing. Gorbachev walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a volume of Lenin's writings. Lenin said that the goal of communism was to provide abundance for all, to create a society where everyone's needs were met, where people lived better than under capitalism. That was the promise. That's what the revolution was supposed to achieve. He held up the book. And 70 years later, Soviet citizens are lining up by the thousands to eat at a capitalist restaurant because we haven't fulfilled that promise. We haven't created abundance. We haven't met people's needs. We haven't provided a better life than capitalism. So yes, Gorbachev said, his voice heavy with frustration, McDonald's opening in Moscow is embarrassing, but not because it's American, not because it's capitalist, because it shows that we have failed. The Soviet system has failed to provide what people need and want. And unless we reform that system fundamentally, unless we learn from what works regardless of ideology, we will continue to fail. The room was silent. Gorbachev's words hung in the air, a stark admission of Soviet failure from the General Secretary himself. Finally, Yakovlev spoke up. Mikhail Sergeyevich, what do you want to say publicly about McDonald's? The Western media is covering this extensively. Our own media needs guidance on how to report it. What message do we want to send? Gorbachev thought for a moment. We say that McDonald's opening in Moscow is a positive development. It's a sign of Soviet openness to the world, of our willingness to cooperate with Western businesses, of the success of perestroika in attracting foreign investment. We welcome McDonald's and hope that other Western companies will follow their example. And we say, Gorbachev continued, that we hope Soviet enterprises will learn from McDonald's example, will adopt their standards of service and quality, will use this as an opportunity to improve our own practices. In other words, Ligachev said dryly, we admit that capitalist methods are superior to socialist methods. We admit that we have much to learn, Gorbachev corrected. We admit that Soviet socialism has not achieved what it promised, and that we need to change. That's what glasnost means, honesty about our problems. And that's what perestroika means: willingness to change, to adopt what works, to put people's needs ahead of ideology. Over the following days and weeks, the McDonald's in Pushkin Square remained enormously popular. The lines continued, though they gradually became shorter as the novelty wore off. Soviet citizens continued to treat a visit to McDonald's as something special, an experience of Western-style service and quality that was rare in Soviet life. The Western media continued to cover it as a symbol of the changing Soviet Union, of the opening to the West, of the gradual erosion of communist ideology in favor of capitalist practices. Soviet hardliners continued to see it as an embarrassment, a betrayal of socialist principles, evidence that Gorbachev's reforms were going too far. And for ordinary Soviet citizens, McDonald's represented something simpler: a clean, well-organized restaurant that served good food with fast, friendly service. A small taste of what life could be like if Soviet institutions worked as well as this American corporation. In his private diary that night, Gorbachev wrote about the McDonald's opening and what it meant. He wrote about his frustration with Soviet inefficiency, his disappointment that 70 years of socialism had failed to provide basic consumer goods and services, his determination to reform the system even if it meant abandoning some socialist principles. But he also wrote about his concerns. McDonald's was successful because it was a small, self-contained operation with Western management. Could the lessons of McDonald's really be applied to the entire Soviet economy? Could 70 years of socialist practice be reformed without destroying the system entirely? Could the Soviet Union adopt capitalist methods while remaining socialist in character? These were the questions that haunted Gorbachev as he pursued his reform program. And McDonald's opening in Moscow crystallized those questions in a very visible, very public way. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union would collapse. The 15 republics would become independent nations. The communist system that had ruled for 74 years would be swept away. And historians would debate whether Gorbachev's reforms had been an attempt to save Soviet socialism or had inadvertently destroyed it. But on January 31st, 1990, watching thousands of Soviet citizens line up enthusiastically for American hamburgers in the heart of Moscow, Gorbachev had said to his advisors in his diary, in his private thoughts, "This is what we have come to. Soviet citizens waiting in line for hours in the freezing cold to eat at an American restaurant, treating it as a special occasion, taking photographs, dressing up their children, all for hamburgers and French fries. This should be humiliating, and it is humiliating, but not in the way my conservative critics think. It's not humiliating because McDonald's is American or capitalist. It's humiliating because it exposes how badly Soviet socialism has failed. For 70 years, we've been telling our people that socialism is superior to capitalism, that collective ownership and central planning will provide abundance for all, that the Soviet system will create a better life than the capitalist West. And now Soviet citizens are demonstrating, with their feet, with their enthusiasm, with their willingness to wait hours in the cold, that they don't believe it, that they prefer what capitalism offers, at least in this instance, to what socialism has provided. McDonald's serves good food quickly and efficiently. Soviet restaurants serve poor food slowly and rudely. McDonald's is clean and well organized. Soviet restaurants are often dirty and chaotic. McDonald's employees are friendly and helpful. Soviet service workers are often surly and indifferent. Why? Why can't Soviet socialism provide what an American corporation provides? Why can't our system match their efficiency, their quality, their service standards? The answer is uncomfortable but undeniable. Because our system doesn't work. Because central planning cannot match market efficiency. Because workers without incentives don't perform as well as workers with incentives. Because monopoly breeds complacency, while competition breeds excellence. These are truths that contradict everything I was taught, everything I believed about socialism. But McDonald's opening in Moscow forces me to confront these truths. I still believe in socialism, in the ideals of equality, of collective welfare, of society organized for the benefit of all rather than the profit of a few. But I'm beginning to understand that the Soviet version of socialism has failed to achieve those ideals. Perhaps real socialism requires incorporating some capitalist mechanisms, markets, competition, profit incentives. Perhaps the choice isn't between pure socialism and pure capitalism, but finding a balance that combines the best of both. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that frightens me, perhaps socialism as we've practiced it is simply unworkable. Perhaps 70 years of Soviet history has been a failed experiment. Perhaps the crowds lining up at McDonald's are telling us that capitalism works and socialism doesn't. I don't want to believe that. I don't want to admit that the Soviet Union, that the revolution, that everything we've built and sacrificed for has been a mistake. But McDonald's opening in Moscow and the enthusiastic response of Soviet citizens makes it very hard to avoid that conclusion. So what do I do? Do I continue with perestroika, knowing that it may destroy the Soviet system I'm trying to save? Do I introduce more market mechanisms, more capitalism, until there's nothing socialist left? Do I admit that we need to learn from the West, that capitalism has lessons to teach us? Or do I listen to the conservatives like Ligachev, who say we should go back to traditional socialism, who see McDonald's as a threat rather than an opportunity? I don't have good answers. All I know is that 30,000 Soviet citizens waited in line today to eat at McDonald's. And that tells me something important about the state of Soviet socialism. It tells me that we have failed our people, that they are hungry not just for hamburgers, but for quality, for efficiency, for service, for the kind of life that we promised them but never delivered. And it tells me that perestroika is necessary, even if I don't know where it will lead, even if it means abandoning some socialist principles, even if it means admitting that we were wrong about some fundamental things. Because the alternative, continuing with a system that doesn't work, that doesn't serve people's needs, that drives them to line up by the thousands for American hamburgers, that alternative is worse. So I will continue with reform. I will continue opening up to the West. I will continue trying to learn from what works, regardless of ideology. And I will live with the embarrassment of watching Soviet citizens embrace capitalism with an enthusiasm they never showed for socialism. Because that embarrassment is the price of honesty, and honesty, glasnost, is what the Soviet Union needs most. That was what the Kremlin said, what Gorbachev said, when the first McDonald's opened in Moscow. Not in any public statement, not in any official pronouncement, but privately, in meetings with advisors, in diary entries in the quiet moments of reflection when the General Secretary of the Soviet Union confronted the uncomfortable truth that his nation's ideology was being rejected by its own citizens. In favor of hamburgers, American hamburgers, served with a smile.